Near the end of the 6th chapter of John, Jesus says, I tell you the truth. Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Some of those who were listening said, this is a difficult saying. Who can accept it? And for that reason, many of them turned back and no longer went about with him. So Jesus asked the 12, do you also wish to go away? Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom can we go? You have the words of eternal life. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. At the beginning of John chapter 6, a crowd of 5,000 people are so excited about Jesus' ministry that they try to take him by force and make him their king. At the end of that same chapter, he's down to only 12 dusty disciples. And in Jesus' opinion, one of them is a devil. You have to wonder, what happened? If it had happened to me, I might have called the nice folks at the Church Growth Institute. I would have explained the whole situation and then said, what went wrong? I had those people eating out of my hand. And some seasoned voice on the other end of the line would say, why don't you go with that whole feeding thing? That seemed to be working for you. Meet people where they are. Rent out a nice dining room. Hire a chef. Put on some soft music. Dim the lights. And then, when they've eaten their fill, ease your message over on them. What was that message again? Well, it's right there in verse 51. Eat my flesh. Yeah, the voice would say, you might want to soften that up a bit. How about try me, you'll like me, or I'm the real thing, or things go better with Jesus. That way you won't scare them off so quickly. You might be able to keep your crowd. If it had happened to me, that's probably what I would have done. But it didn't happen to me. It happened to Jesus, and he doesn't seem to have any interest in drawing or keeping crowds. He seems willing to exchange a few thousand freeloaders for a few honest disciples. There's something different about him, and I think it's this. Jesus is not afraid. The church growth movement, on the other hand, is. It was conceived in fear. You may not remember this, but there was a time in America just after World War II when people started coming to church in droves. I like to think of it as the church going boom, because it coincided almost precisely with the baby boom between 1946 and 1964. Soldiers and sailors who came home from the war married their high school sweethearts, settled down, and began having babies, lots of babies. They brought those babies to church, and for a while at least, church nurseries and sanctuaries and Sunday school classes were full. But then, for a number of reasons, things began to change. In the late 60s and early 70s, church attendance and giving began to decline. And church leaders began to wring their hands, wondering, what can we do? I call that period of American church history the Great Panic. And one of the results was the so-called church growth movement, an undisguised effort to get people to come to church, or at least to keep them from leaving. Because diminishing numbers mean failure. And if there is one thing our culture will not forgive, it is failure. On the personal level, it is as close to hell as most of us will ever come in this life. A failed math test, a failed marriage, a failed business venture, a failed church. Is there anything sadder? We live in a culture of success, and we measure our success as we measure our failure by the numbers. The church I served in Washington, D.C. was built to hold 1,200 people back in 1955. And in those days, it almost did. But on my first Sunday, In July of 2000, there were 141 people in the pews. Over the next few weeks, I was told in subtle and not so subtle ways that it was my job as the new pastor to fill those pews. Behind those comments was the fear that if I couldn't do it, that historic church would fail. The numbers would go down. The dollars would dry up. And someday somebody would buy the building and turn it into a nightclub. Something had to be done. And so I started thinking about what I could do to bring in the crowds. Maybe I could work a few miracles, feed a few multitudes, you know, Jesus stuff. My success depended on it. And then I remembered something that had happened years before. Right out of college, I got a job as a part-time youth minister at a little Baptist church in Kentucky. I wanted to have the biggest and best youth group in town, and one of the first things I did was to weigh every kid who came on Wednesday night, because it sounded so much more impressive to say that we had a 1,136-pound youth group than to say we had a group of 9 kids. I did everything I could to increase attendance. We started our own radio station, held the world's biggest kite contest. We made regular trips to the amusement park. But I remember the day it changed for me, when I called to invite one of our youth to something we were doing, and he said, no thanks, that he and his friend were planning to go to a movie. And that's when it hit me that I could never compete, that these kids had all the entertainment they needed and a whole lot more. And the only thing I could give them that they weren't getting everywhere else was Jesus. So I made up my mind to give them exactly that and to keep it up, even if the youth group dwindled down to less than 1,000 pounds. Because look at him, Jesus. He's not afraid of failure. He doesn't even seem to think in the categories of failure and success. When they try to make him king, he runs. When they ask for bread, he offers his flesh. His whole agenda seems countercultural. And if we represent him faithfully, so will ours. People will wander into the church off the streets, and instead of hearing us talk about how they can have more and be more, they will hear us talk about giving everything up and handing it over to Jesus. And it may sound crazy to them, so crazy that they stay to hear what we say next. Because they've tried doing things the world's way, and they know just how much or how little success they've had. What if this Jesus we keep talking about is right? What if he could do it better or differently? What if he is in touch with the kind of success our culture doesn't know anything about? Think about it. We talk about bread that's made from yeast and flour. He talks about the bread of his flesh and blood. We talk about life as a beating heart and brainwave activity. He talks about life that is abundant and everlasting. We talk about success as making more money and having more things. He talks about success as a kind of complete surrender, not holding on tighter and tighter, but letting go more and more. What if he's right? And what if coming to him, feeding on him, trusting in him, believing in him, begins to free us from all our fear? Wouldn't this existence of ours begin to feel more like life and less like some grim struggle to succeed? More like living and less like staving off failure? It's possible. And maybe that's why we keep coming back to church week after week, year after year. Maybe we know, as Peter did, that Jesus has the words of eternal life. And we hunger for them, like a starving man hungers for bread. And when people ask us why we come here, we shrug our shoulders and say, really, where else would we go?